Hi everyone. Thank you for thank you all for being here today and welcome to this week's Thursday lecture with David Leven of LEVENBETTS. David Leven is the co-founder of LEVENBETTS, an award-winning New York City-based architecture practice. He's also a tenured associate professor at Parsons School of Constructed Environments. David's professional practice, LEVENBETTS, was founded with Stella Betts in 1997 and focuses on projects at all scales of urban design, public buildings, houses and housing, workspaces, exhibitions, and furniture. The office employs investigation based in art practices and visual culture, interrogation of spatial, programmatic, and site givens, and a deep knowledge of building systems to make architecture. Today, he will be presenting on adaptation. With great pleasure, please welcome David Leven of LEVENBETTS.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm going to click with this hand and speak into the mic with this one because it's a little too tricky. But I want to thank all of you for coming out today and thank Brenda and the student committee for inviting me here and also just making me feel so welcome and well taken care of. Sharon Tomer, thank you so much for your help. And then it was very interesting to speak with David Dugal in his professional practice with his students this morning. And I look forward to more discussion today. So as Brenda said, the title of this talk is called Adaptation, but I'm going to just start with a very quick, irresponsibly fast introduction to our practice, LEVENBETTS, that Brenda described. I share with Stella. And there's about 15 to 18 of us these days. We're the largest we've ever been. And we do, I'm going to sort of drill in at scales now. So from largest to the smallest, we work at the scales of the office and life sciences building scale. This is a building in Harlem called the Tasty building. It's 300,000 square feet. We've worked in the educational space such as this at Cornell University, working on projects for the architecture school, for the computer systems laboratory in computer sciences, in the operational research department for a distance learning classroom connected with their Cornell Tech campus in New York City, and we worked with several other departments at Cornell. I'm giving you a very, very brief glimpse of a library because that's what most of this lecture is going to be about today, the adaptation of buildings. We do, and we love working at this smaller scale of the pavilion. This is a pavilion called Zoid in an art park in upstate New York. And then in our investigating mass timber technologies and supply chains, a pavilion that we did at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. We've also done and worked at the furniture scale. These are benches in the Miami Design District made of ultra-high performance concrete. And then there's a large part of our practice that is ongoing with kind of the primary focus, I would say, which is the civic and public focus of the practice these days, that has to do with houses. This is a book that we just published about a year or so ago called 13 Ways of Looking at a House, that really cracks open the way we like to look at the program of the house, the geometries, materiality, and just the way a building sits in its site. And the house, the book obviously goes through the pictures of the houses. I think you can hear me a little bit better now. And you're working in different materials. As well as, we'd like to show these comparatively, but also to compare the basic essential diagrams of the architecture, to compare them across the buildings, looking at putting all the plans in comparison to look at the way the different projects kind of sit from smallest to largest. And then really drawing out a series of wall sections and details in a series called Thick and Thin that we find to be very interesting in terms of looking at different occupations relative to the way the buildings are built. And then all coming back home, if you will, to the space of the domestic and how that space feels and how it's used. I will linger on this slide if you'd like to purchase it. If not, I can flash it up later on. But so I'd like to get to the main topic tonight, which is adaptation. We use the term as architects adaptive reuse. I feel that the term is a little bit constricting. We just sort of are meant to then reuse, and I find the definition, the larger definitions of adaptation, to help us understand what our role is as architects, as, let's say, stewards of the built environment, or some of the stewards, if you will, within this. So in biology, the definition, a change or the process of change by which an organism or species becomes better suited to its environment. So the species is, let's say it's us that we share with other species, and perhaps the organism is also architecture. And I think we're at a point now in our human history and in the history of our built environment where we have to be thinking about the adaptation of the way we build, to adapt the way we build to an environment that actually our building practices has contributed to its degradation. The art critic Jerry Saltz writes, Darwin's assertion was not survival of the strongest, but survival of those that are able to adapt. So once again, those is all of us as a species, but all of us, let's say, as architects, and how do we start to understand adaptation within these sort of momentous shifts in the climate and in our social structures and concerns that we've all been facing, dealing with, and discussing in recent years. I love to start with this photograph. Many of you in this room will know this photograph. Others may not think it's such a big deal. Of course, we see pictures of Earth all the time. This is considered to be many to be one of the most important, most impactful environmental photographs of all time, taken by William Aldrin, the astronaut, in 1968. The first time that humans saw themselves from outside the planet. It's called Earthrise, and it's taken from the moon. This photograph I love not just because it's a beautiful photograph of the sun rising right down on the axis of a crossing street in Manhattan called Manhattan Henge. I love it because it's a beautiful photograph, but also what I find to be, again, drilling down from scales of the moon to let's say, the planet or the terrestrial context within which I work, is understanding our built environment relative to much larger environmental factors and forces that are at play. Then drilling way down, this image counterposes a drawing from Alberti's 10 Books in Architecture from 1485 with the sculptor Gordon Matta Clark's photograph called Splitting from 1974. In Alberti, we read just simply the solidity and the curvature, the form of architecture, where what's in the middle, let's say, is either a solid material or taken care of by others. Matta Clark been splitting in the 1970s, perhaps a building built somewhere in the 20s, 30s, or 40s, gets us to the layers so that we start to realize that there are so many of these layers of buildings, for better or for worse, and I'm going to get into that later, that we as architects are responsible for. And the Matta Clark image is particularly important in this discussion of adaptation and how we reuse and adapt our buildings to new contexts. So a little bit more context of the free library. What is the free library? The free library is where one can go to borrow a book. And its history, as James Campbell writes in Libraries: A World History, dates back to, he claims, as a public library from 39 BC. This is a place where, let's say, the public, I think in ancient Rome that would be defined rather narrowly, still can go to gain knowledge. Vitruvius writes in the same century that every city of a decent size should have one of these things called a public library. This image, this is obviously not an historical sign. However, it's taken in the Baths of Caracalla that Campbell explains also contained books. And because the books were most likely on clay tablets, reading a book in the bath might have been kind of okay, not a bad idea. Papyrus might have still been problematic, like our paper books today. This image is not a public library, but it's a Middle Ages library in Korea that houses Buddhist texts, the most important Buddhist texts in the world. The books are on wood. The books are made of wood. The building is made of wood. And I show this image because the ventilation strategies and the materiality that is antimicrobial and preservative of the wood and the interior environment has enabled this building to operate for around 600 or 700 years. Something that we should be thinking about now. Fast forward several centuries after many centuries of private collections, and the free library pops up again in mid-19th century Paris with Henri Lebrousse's Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, essentially the first public library after centuries of privateness of book collections. And what's significant about the library is, and what enabled it to be public, was also because it could stay open later because of the advent of gaslighting. But that was combined with the use of iron and stone that allowed the gaslight to be used without as much fear of fire from the wood roofs that had made up larger public spaces. The other thing that's fascinating about this library is that although the stacks were private and the librarian would control them, the periodicals, if at the time, were open to browsing. So this is the time of Haussmann, this is the time of the Boulevard, this is the time of Baudelaire inventing the term the flaneur. So this idea of browsing for knowledge and publicness was critically important in this library and vilified at the time. It was popular and it was crass. But then we go to Carnegie, the Carnegie Corporation, let's say, begins just about 35 years later in the 1880s, where the Scottish philanthropist develops essentially almost like a tech startup, prototypical building libraries, cookie cutter one after the next, giving them to cities to the tune of somewhere around 1,900 libraries across the United States and another 200 or so in other countries. But the further significance of these libraries through Carnegie is that the stacks are open. So this idea of knowledge being able to be browsed and understood on one's own terms is a momentous shift in the idea of the public library as seen in Carnegie. So Pompidou Center opens in Paris in 1971. So now we're 120 years after Lebrousse. But we think, well, that's a museum. Why is this a library? It was actually planned as a library first. So the big shift is the library becomes part of other programs, cultural programs, and also connected with significant public spaces in front of the library. Sendai Mediatek by Toyo Ito in 2001. It's a media library. It's new media. This is the early 2000s. Everybody's convinced that the book is going away. We don't need the book anymore. Interesting that the stacks are holding lots of books. So Ito and everybody else knew that books were here to stay, but there are many other types of media that are happening now in the public library. So in New York City, for the context of where we're working on libraries, the first public library is in the East Village. It's called the Ottendorfer Library, built largely for the German community that settled in the East Village at that time. And it is this skinny little building on the side and connected to a public health clinic on the right, much larger. So maybe this idea of combining libraries with other programs is not really new at all. Carnegie libraries in New York City, there were 67 built. There are 57 still in use. They often have grass and park space around them. In the 70s, so this is 1974, 3 years these photographs come from, between 66 and 74. This is the exact same time Pompidou Center is built. Open to glass, French high-tech, connected with public space. I would contend incredibly optimistic idea about knowledge and the city. New York City in the 70s is going through tough times. The city was bankrupt, and the libraries, although they were being provided for still, they were updating, they were adding to neighborhoods where that the Carnegies hadn't touched, let's say 50 years earlier. But man, are they dark, and they don't have a lot of light, and they're tough. They're defensive in their nature. I don't know if you guys can see that. Yeah. So this photograph, this is done by a photographer in New York City named Elizabeth Felicello, who took pictures in her a photo essay in the 2014, showing the kind of the quotidian daily life of the Carnegies, of the Lindsay. We called them Lindsay boxes. And it's kind of an important moment in 2014 because we're shifting over now to what we might contend is a new era or let's say the next era. You go from Carnegie to Lindsay, and I don't know if we call this Bloomberg de Blasio, if we're just going to name it by our mayors, but their administrations allotted significant funding. De Blasio's administration allotted $300 million in 2019 for libraries. And these are just a group of some of these, mostly, some are new, but most are adaptations. So kind of rebuilding and updating the libraries that had been built, mostly the Lindsays. Updating them to new energy codes, new ways of working, new ways of finding knowledge. So a couple of maps. This is the map of New York City, and what I'd like to. This is significant, just in terms of explaining the New York City public library systems. So this is what's called NYPL, New York Public Library, and it is comprised of Manhattan, Staten Island, and the Bronx. 92 branch libraries. Brooklyn, BPL, 60 branch libraries. And that's a different system than New York. Queens, QPL, a different system altogether, but the system that contains the automated book sorting for the entire city, I have no idea how they figure that out. 62 libraries. So about 214 branch libraries across the city with their main branches, NYPL on Fifth Avenue, BPL on Grand Army Plaza, with the exhibition of the Jay-Z's exhibition, The Book of Hove, which is still installed, and Queens, not quite as grand as the others, but still vitally important to this neighborhood. This photograph is taken from the bus station across the street. I'd like to just lay out kind of a rubric through which we look at these libraries and just thinking about the different scales, the different ways that the libraries function, from the city, the building, the book, to the body. We think about this in the design of our libraries, and we kind of use these as studio models, studio rubrics as well. So at the level of the city, there's NYPLs, but the steps, this is a significant public space, as is Bryant Park, which is the park behind the library, a beautiful park, bucolic as New York City can be, but technologically driven in that the stacks sit below the park. Classic overlapping in New York City terms. The building, these are 5 of the buildings. These are the ones that I'm going to be talking about in our practice today, and 5+1 images that I'm going to go through. So the building, I just wanted to show you, give you a brief glimpse of what I'll be talking about. And then, of course, in adaptation, and this is a critically important point for students to understand when adapting older buildings, the things that you need to know right out of the gates is, how is that building built, what's it made of, and what are its challenges? These are its structural frames, by and large. The book, obviously libraries have books. Big deal, right? Libraries, books. However, throughout history, we see many different types of the way that the book is combined with the architecture and the structure, such as Trinity Library in Dublin, where the structure of the building and the book stacks and their categorization and cataloging are Loctite. So building architecture and books all stepping in line. Or, from the opposite direction, at Toyo Ito's Tama Art Library, books and structure really don't care at all about one another. The books sort of flow through the structural grid of the library. Or another example, an amazing example that I got to visit this summer was Alberto Calax Vasconcelos Library in Mexico City, where the books, they hang from this massive structure that spans across the roof of the building. And they just make this incredible environment, like really hovering above the spaces below. And then finally, the body. What does this mean? It means how do we move throughout the library? Where do we sit? And what's our relationship to the book? Is the book chained to a pew as it was in medieval times? Michelangelo's Laurentian Library, where the books were programmed and categorized and cataloged and only sat at those pews. So if you wanted to go to see a book, you had to go to that seat and sit there and read that book or those books only. Way forward to Exeter Library of Louis Kahn, where the desks are connected directly with the facade. The design of the facade and the millwork have a direct material relationship, a direct formal relationship. They're in that same bay spacing of the facade, but the books actually, they're just sort of stacks, no big deal. But then the robot, like this is what's making those stacks below Bryant Park, that's what allows you to get your book. So in this case, the robot is bringing you the book. You can be stationary. So very counter to a medieval time when you had to go and sit at a book that was chained to a pew, quite literally. So the adapted libraries that I want to talk about are these 5. They're, as you can see, the floor plates are all quite similar. The largest one being this one here, which is 2 full stories above grade plus a cellar level below. So, for example, in our Lindsay boxes, as I described, the floor plate of this library is about 8,000 square feet. This is about 8,000 square feet. And this library is about 18,000, almost 19,000 square feet. Brooklyn Heights Interim Library. So the primary adaptation of this library had to do with a very light touch. We were installing this library in a church between the nave of the church and the parish house. It was an interim library, but it had to still have a feeling of permanence and a place that people wanted to go. The light touch had to do with just that. We could affect no change on the facade, but we also wanted to bring light, so a double light touch, the transmission of light through that space. Sorry, I didn't explain this. This is before. It's not what we did. So you can see in these images, the library is this sort of rather small space, but wedged between the church, the parish house is up above, and the plan, quite simply, and we kind of coined this term, the bookworm, and I'll explain the worm in a moment, that moves through the space, enclosing a meeting room as well as staff offices, while then just sort of bellying back out to create the larger space of the reading room. A very small space. A translucent material using graphics and light to enliven the space. This is a little model that we made of the worm. And then the Brooklyn Heights, the most famous poet we can imagine from Brooklyn Heights being Walt Whitman, wrote a poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and we sort of unwound the stanza structure of Whitman's poem and grafted it onto the material so that if one wanted to read the entire poem, you would have to walk 100 feet and return, sort of an old-fashioned typewriter fashion. Absurd. However, perhaps one could make other poems and other groupings and other thoughts about words and knowledge and thoughts that Whitman may or may not have had, but maybe John Cage would have had in that way. And this image of the staff office behind in this area where the bookworm bellies back out at the circulation desk. So Borough Park Library is the one that I mentioned was the largest one at about 18,000 square feet. The primary adaptation of this library had to do with opening up a building's facade to its street and its community, as well as to a newly installed garden. Many of these buildings, the library buildings, were built under the allowable bulk, the FAR, floor area ratio, that was allowed by zoning code, and enabled so that there could be space around the library. But oftentimes, especially in underserved neighborhoods, those spaces remained concrete and unused for decades. So that the challenge of a rather sort of modernist, deco-ish, stately library turns out in present time to have to do with perhaps, maybe something's going on in the brick building, and then digging further, we find that there's a whole lot going on, and it's not good, and it requires the steel frame to be remediated, and the only way to do that is to reclad. So the adaptation here in recladding was really the challenge, and of course, and happily for us, the opportunity. We came to the project, it was a very small renovation, and upon the investigation of the facade, it turned into a complete renovation, which we were pleased to perform those services for. And as you see in this image, to reclad the building in glass fiber reinforced concrete panels with embossed graphics, a sort of a pattern that we devised, but also to bring this building up to current energy code. So, keeping the structure warm and dry, and there's the structure, was a very important part of this project. So it's a steel frame. It is completely encased in concrete, except for right behind the brick, where in 1952, the brick ran by and sort of fabric acted as waterproofing, but probably not until, not much past the 80s, when the water started to go in and degrade the steel structure. So remediating that steel and then cladding it with these panels essentially is our charge. And you can see it's important in this image to, if I can point out the structure, you can just sort of see it. Obviously the structure in here, the structure is here, but this is really where we're operating technologically and aesthetically now on a library like this. Whereas if you'll remember the images of the rusting steel, you could see that the structure, the cladding is right here, right in front of the beam. So our buildings are bulking out, and they have to in order to meet. This is a LEED silver building. I'm going to lead you into the garden in a moment to the side, a senior garden here, and then a gated and protected children's garden behind, and then the GFRC panels gently curving to sort of foster that movement around the building. And this garden that we've designed with our landscape architect, Elizabeth Kennedy, landscape architects, is such an important part of the building, not only for mitigating heat island effect, but also to create a symbiotic relationship, or let's say an awareness across the membrane of the glass here that we are now opening up. These are some images from Elizabeth's office, just showing the seating and the benches, some of the plantings. There's a movie screening wall. These are images from the inside currently of the library. We're removing the ceilings to gain as much height as possible, which is something that we love to do. We think that large spaces like this that are over your head are inspiring. This image, looking back towards the garden through the glass. So the street is here. We're opening this up much more, and then opening up along this line. And at the back of that same space, opening up to a movie screen in the children's garden. So the reading room is directly connected with the garden. And then on the second floor, the views in very large windows are out to that same garden and out to the street. And then the many different ages of children in their spaces are provided for. This is a screen of children's drawings from a book on children's drawings from the 1950s and 70s that we're turning into a tapestry. We work a lot in model. We talked about this in the professional practice class this morning, how critically important the model making is to our practice and how detrimental it is to our bottom line. The city will not pay for model making. When you write your contracts, try to get your models paid for. This model, instead of showing plan, this is the ground floor. The reading rooms at both levels are sort of anchored to the southwest and self-shading from this cantilever at the ground level. And then all of the support and staff spaces are in this L shape around, organizing these spaces with their programmatic pressures is really critical. When we thought the book was going away, we actually were designing for fewer books and more program spaces and more community spaces. And in the course of time, we've been designing and working with library systems. The book has sort of resurged, and now we're still putting we're putting more stuff into the same amount of space. So the challenges are challenges and opportunities. There's just an image of the model from the front. How am I doing time? Good. So Baisley Park Library is the one Queens library that we're working on. The other ones are based in Brooklyn. Baisley it's just north of JFK Library. It's near the Baisley Park Pond, so there's a kind of a community urban park nearby. It's a real tough neighborhood, but quite vibrant. It sits along a commercial strip that you see here in the figure ground. You can see the larger buildings. Everything's on that strip. A lot of churches, a lot of auto body shops, a lot of small mom and pop businesses. So it's a vibrant neighborhood, and when we go to the community board meetings that are run by one of the local reverends, she keeps us all in line and really is so committed to the health of the neighborhood, and therefore is excited about this library. So designed in the 60s. Finished in 1970. Again, sort of a tough little building. Some light out to the avenue, but a little bit starved. This is the view today. Kind of more brick that's not doing too well. A little bit better here in this library. The interiors, the architect at the time was obsessed with circles. And we've kind of taken on the circle as a theme that we'd like to think we're even making it, better or, more clarified. So these are just some rendered images of, this facade as we are planning this. So opening up the facade to the boulevard much more, but most significantly, moving the entry. The entry was here, kind of tight, sort of small, completely inaccessible for Americans with disabilities. And we're moving the entry to the side yard, which I'll show in a minute, which is a completely disused, it's just a lot with a lot of weeds. So we're able to activate that space, and you can see in this image that vestibule, sort of a semi-conditioned space. Elizabeth Kennedy is helping us with the landscape again, and then making a children's garden again on the side, this side of the building. So on the what's called Foch Boulevard side, it's the brick wall that kind of changes from which was the sort of fancy brick to the common brick, or clinkers to common, and then over the years, patching and staining. So we're replacing as much of that brick as we can as well. And then this is that image then of that side yard that we're hoping to produce with the vestibule moved, the garden behind that space, and I'll show you the form of it in a moment, the utility sheds for maintenance and garbage, and the enclosure of a courtyard. So the main adaptation in this space was taking an open courtyard, and because of space constraints and the growth in the youth population in the neighborhood, enclosing that courtyard that we were desperately opposed to, but have taken it on as a design challenge and made what we call the brick flying saucer with clear story windows up above that I'll show an interior in a moment. But this is kind of an important series of images. This is a section of the quote-unquote before where you see the courtyard. So the void here, the enclosed spaces and the courtyard, but then flashing forward to the inclusion of that flying saucer, the skylight, the clear story windows, and then you may note the kind of the puffing up of the walls to create a more viable waterproofing and insulation strategy. And then the detail of how we are in the vestibule creating still a brick wall, but fully insulated to meet energy codes, as well as a green roof. We've recently, in the past 2 years, I believe, in New York City, had a local law passed by the mayor's office that mandates either green roofs or photovoltaics on all public buildings. This is the little teeny vestibule that's going to get that green roof. The rest of the building will have photovoltaic panels. Flashing to the models, as usual, I think the bookworm came back in this scheme where the books are hugging the entire perimeter of the building in the previous architect's circular pattern. This is the children's space with the brick flying saucer above, an existing drum that I'm going to show you a bit in a moment, and then opening up to windows to the main boulevard, and then the all-important, this is actually the foundation of the vestibule. Actually, it was a model before we were charged with the vestibule. And then a view up to the roof, and understanding that whole structural system that we have to fireproof, we have to waterproof, we have to insulate from below, because there's a membrane roof that was installed less than 10 years ago, which means you cannot touch it by New York City law, even though you may need to. Or it should receive that, I should say. So some views to the interior, keeping the space open and full of light. Ooh, sorry about the fuzzy picture. But that the clear story windows up above, the illuminated mesh ceiling that I showed in the model before, and then the drum of the public multi-purpose room that we're working with an artist from Ghana named Serge Cloty, who he recycles plastic buckets, orange and yellow ones only, in these pieces, and then he cuts them into squares about 3 inches square, and he will wire these together with copper wire, and then we're working with him to figure out how to make a support system for that wall that allows the children to enjoy it without picking at those little copper wires, which we're very concerned about. But it's a beautiful piece, and we're happy. There it is. We're so happy to be working with him on the piece. So the East Flatbush Library this library's primary adaptation had to do with the similar issues that I've been talking about, having to do with openness to the street, reconnecting a building with its community, all the while making LEED silver envelopes and energy efficient envelopes in these buildings, which are really truly only, I would say in quotes, addressing the issues of operational carbon. Embodied carbon is not mandated by our codes currently, which may be, we'll see in the next 5 years if we make the climate estimates, if we come in below the 1.5 degrees, may be terribly to our detriment. East Flatbush's original library was built in 1952. Just a very modest storefront building, plate glass, open to the street, renovated and expanded in 1988, but then kind of got even though it was later than the Lindsay administration's buildings, it kind of got the Lindsay treatment, which is like closed down and defensive. So our challenge in this pretty tough building with kind of plastic barrel vault skylights that only fed the staff offices and created a dark reading room, was to open that building back up to its community. We were just so fortunate to open up the library on June 6th of this year. We've been back to the library many times. There's a lot of kind of graffiti and tough roll down great gates in the neighborhood, and the community seems to be so terribly excited about having this library back, having access to Wi-Fi, having a place for their children to go, that the facade and the spaces seems to be just beautifully maintained. The facade is a pleated aluminum with a paint finish, and it has a graphic it's actually a lenticular reading. So we wrote the words East Flatbush on one side of the pleat, so you can sort of see that graphic, and on the other side we just wrote the word library. So if you come from the east, you see East Flatbush. If you arrive from the west, you read library. If you face it straight on, it's confusing. And it's a nice pattern. And here, these are images of kind of figuring out all the layers of this facade, from the graphics to the paint, to the pleats, to the curtain system, to the connection back to the library, through the insulation, all the barriers that are necessary to waterproof and keep it warm and hang on the building. We worked through three-dimensional diagrams and details. The facade, although it looks random, is comprised of two panel types that we were able to flip when determining where the panels would go to create even more variation. So it looks completely, let's say, varied across the facade. And these are images from its fabrication. And then the final images, and it's a rain screen facade, so it can stand off the building, which enabled us to kind of keep that pattern that you see against the sky, as opposed to a drip edge coming over the top. Water does not come through, it sheds back to the roof. So then I had to do a detailing that we worked on for the panels to go to sort of attach to the back of this facade and go off the parapet. Interiors, this is what the reading room looked like. So our challenge in opening up this building, not just to its community, was opening up to the sky. So before section, after section, 3 banks of pairs of skylights, so 6 skylights coursing through the existing steel structure, really a surgery project. It's a steel frame with wood false work that posts up and creates the drainage pattern, drainage planes. In this image, you can see those skylights poking up through that framing, and then and the models as well. Let me just jump to the interiors again. Open space, no corridors at all. Not wasting. We can't afford to have corridors, and it's a better space for librarians to see across and to be able to monitor and address the needs of the patrons. These before images of that structural system. So the steel with all the wood infill that we then started to slice through in order to create these skylights. So they're just sort of LVL and wood frame sitting on top of these existing and a couple of new steel beams to achieve an atmosphere like this, which with this acoustic plaster board finish that kind of created a cloud-like feeling up above, with HVAC in slots ringing the entire reading room, and then translucent panels to continue this idea of shared light and openness and luminosity alongside of warmer materials on the perimeter. And these are looking into the children's spaces with the use of wood for all furniture, and then natural. These are linoleum-based flooring products, as well as tackboard, with this idea of healthy materials as such an important part of spaces for people, especially children. And then the adult reading area with the wood millwork as well. children's space, and then finally looking back to the street. This is the last library I'm going to show. I think we're going to be right on time. The Red Hook Library is, this library's primary adaptation. I sound like a broken record. It's about openness, opening back up while making a waterproofed, but most importantly in this building, flood-proofed envelope. This is, I don't know if you guys know this neighborhood in Brooklyn. Red Hook is right on the water. I'm going to show an image, but the original library was a Carnegie, not like the sort of stately Victorian ones, but a kind of a wacky Italianate library. Wood interiors, burned down in 1947, rebuilt in 1974 in the style of the maybe late parking garage, what one might call it. Tough little building. Really not terribly inspiring spaces, closed off from light. But here's the flood. So it went from fire to flood. I think Red Hook is rather biblical. The flood zone in Superstorm Sandy came all the way into the library here, damaging a good portion of the library. Our charge was not to renovate the damage that had sort of been remediated, but to bring this building up to flood code. So beginning with that before section of that low, mean kind of parking garage type roof to a higher ceiling and waterproofing and the floodproofing around. And the important part of this, and this is a little bit in the weeds here, but in order to bring a building up to flood code, you not only had to make you have to make a flood wall that goes 1 foot past the base flood elevation, which is called the design flood elevation. You have to resist the hydrostatic pressure. When Red Hook floods, the water goes under the buildings and pushes up through the slabs. So, fine, we'll just pour a big slab on top, not a problem. However, the problem in Red Hook, in that tough little building, was that the bottoms of the girder were 7'0" and 3/4, and the engineer said we need 18 inches. So great, the girder's gonna be here. I think we would all hit our heads walking into the library. So we had to, we proposed, we did a study of rebuilding the library, which was much too expensive because digging in the ground in Red Hook basically means you're gonna be making a Superfund. You'll be in a Superfund site because the ground might be toxic. Don't dig in the ground in Red Hook. So we, in having to then raise the library, the roof 18 inches, we said, why don't we just go up like 5'9" or so? And so what we're doing, hoping to do, is we're raising this girder with this roof system up to here. And we are then building a flood wall, pouring an 18-inch deep slab, insulating, and then applying a concrete brick with recycled glass as its cement content and aggregate. So yeah, we're raising the roof. And we're also moving the entrance. The entrance is here. The corner, the main intersection is here. So the entrance goes from here, where nobody really knows where it is, to the intersection of a major thoroughfares. And that's the corner, and those are the little glass block windows that you can't see out of. And that is the girder. Oops, sorry. That's the girder at 7 foot. And then it will be raised. We will be lifting the landscape, creating rain gardens and ADA ramps to get accessibility up into the building. This view from what's called Dwight Street, and then raising it, and then really making like kind of an ethereal atmosphere of the brick, not a red brick building. This neighborhood has the very famous Red Hook houses, which were built in the 1930s under Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia's, the New York City Housing Authority program that houses approximately 6,000, if they say 6,000 people, it houses way more than that. So we're making a brick building, but we're keeping it light and ethereal, and we're also applying what we're calling a basket weave pattern to the brick, perforating the brick, allowing it to be light, keeping air flowing through it. This is the raised entry. I'll show you the bricks in a moment. And there's the basket we've developed through understanding a manufacturer's brick dimensions. And we found that we could go from their standard sizes, 1, 2, let's say large, medium, and small, and we could pop out medium and span and make that perforated at the parapets and at the solar screens on the east side of the building. We got not a ton of bricks, but we got a pallet of bricks delivered to our model shop, and we just started playing with them. And we had our first conversation with the contractor the other day about the bricks and their subcontractor that was so terrible that we invited them to the office to come see these so that we could talk about how the drawings, what we mean by the drawings. So we're going to have to battle this one out to make sure the brick comes out right. In the model, in this case, the books kind of nestle around these pods, keeping the reading room mainly open. These are the large concrete girders. And then the garden, we're working with landscape architects to make this a flood-resilient garden that slows down storm surge from both directions, makes a much more pleasant place to be, and also fosters these views through across the library and through. And this image of looking at the much more raised reading room, I think, is going to be a much more pleasant space. And then the garden, and you can see all the way through with these large apertures that we're opening up. So this is for real. Let me just explain that in the next several weeks, these columns will all get sheared, and the foundation contractor, who's also, he says, look, I rolled the Beekman Theater down 42nd Street, and we left all the glasses on the table, and not one fell off. If that's true or not, he said, this is a piece of cake. We're productively nervous. And then finally, sorry for the fuzzy image here, operational carbon versus embodied carbon, where this is a small library in the Queens Museum. We're renovating all of the office spaces and making a children's museum in the renowned Queens Museum that sits on Corona Park in Flushing Meadows in Queens, and we're using all mass timber in this project. It's interior, but we want to sequester carbon. We don't want to build with lots of layers. We're using CLT panels that will be brought in and make partitions between all of the offices. We'll make constructions in the Children's Museum, and we'll make the environment of this little library within which essentially is going to be the museum about the museum in the project. So, and I think, we've been doing a lot of work understanding how to make our buildings, tight in terms of operational carbon, reducing energy usage. But what we're not doing, and is not in our codes, is what our buildings are made of yet. And we're excited to be working with this material that's really going to address the issues of embodied carbon in our projects and help trying to push them as much as we possibly can. That's it.
Thank you so much to David Leven for this lecture. We will now allow for discussion and take questions from the audience.
That was 52 minutes. We have lots of time. Yes.
I was interested when you were talking about like carbon sequestration and embodied carbon in materials. I feel like a major source of like plastic waste in construction is like insulation. Yeah. Have you taken any approaches to finding like lower embodied carbon in insulation?
Yes. No, actually. We thought we did. And we've used cellulose, so in that case, yes. We then are using mineral wool throughout all of our projects. which can get wet, and it's made from minerals. And then, of course, with our new consciousness, are really quite we're learning things as we go along. We've found that mineral wool is massively energy intensive to produce, because you're basically taking rocks and you're spinning it into fibers. So we're trying to transition the insulation into cellulose, basically. So interesting you asked me that question about insulation. I just took pictures when walking through your quad. You have GFRC panels with blue foam behind. Right across you have Hokie stone with mineral wool behind, but then just farther down the road you've got Hokie stone buildings with the green foam behind. So this issue of insulation, it's critically important, because the foams they're energy intensive, they're made of plastic, and they're killing the planet.
Thank you.
Yeah. Don't get me started on insulation. But while you're looking for somebody else, I think this whole issue of the types of materials we're using, yes, we're getting very good at making tight buildings. We then, of course, have to use mechanical means to then ventilate those tight buildings. And if we don't, of course, we make sick buildings, because a lot of the materials in our buildings are plastic. That's a plastic wall. That paint is, it's a petroleum product. And so if we're in buildings that are tight, of course, we're breathing that, and it's changing our body chemistry in very negative ways. So are we trading our operation for our embodied? We obviously have to do both, but because the time span is so short by which we need to meet these climate goals, the embodied carbon is much more important. It's nice to say that operationally we're going to make buildings that are going to be energy efficient for the next several hundred years, but we only have like 5 where we need to meet these numbers. So operationally, we're really in a race. Carbonly. Anybody else? I'm happy to talk about other things than insulation.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I really enjoyed the illustration and the models. And for the models, do you see those as a final celebration of those projects, or are they part of the design process? And if so, how do they inform your design process, or are they both?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a question that's it's close to our hearts. Well, actually, I wish I took this picture looking that way, because we don't save every model that we've ever made, but we have this whole wall of shelves that we call the boneyard, and there's ideas in there. So the models, and the models that I showed are by and large, they're finished models. They're the ones that we show to the New York City Public Design Commission. We bring them to City Hall and we go, look, here's the model of what this is going to look like, and we get oohs and ahs. But we do build a couple of models along the way when we're studying. They're a little quicker, a little dirtier. And then, the good ones that we used in terms of the process stick around, and we just sometimes just go into the model shop and just kind of look at the wall. Yeah. Oh.
I hope you're not disappointed if I ask a question about your book and not the lecture on libraries that you gave. Because ever since I kind of was introduced to it about a year and a half ago, I was always curious about the number, right? 13 is a very specific number. Were there houses that didn't make it into the cut, or did you stop at 13 or only do 13?
It's a really, really good question. And there's a couple of different answers or contexts around 13. It's unlucky. So we thought we'd challenge that. It follows, there are 2 books. One's called a poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens, written, I think, the 20s. And then Henry Louis Gates wrote a book called 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Man, think in the 80s. So, we were making literary references, if you will. We were writing a book. There were definitely houses that didn't make it in, but not a lot. And then our dear friend David Lewis from LTL Architects introduced us at a panel at Parsons and said, it's really, they're lying because there are 15 books. There are 15 houses. Because one of the projects has three iterations. It was an unbuilt project.
Can you put the discount code back up?
Sure.
Thanks.
I was afraid to cause seizures. It's like seeing a lecture in reverse. So the front of the book is 13 Ways of Looking at a House, David Leven and Stella Betts. Leven Betts with Thomas de Monchaux, 13 words. And then on the back, there are 14 diagrams, one of which is a barcode, which we really did everything we could to get rid of the barcode. But then we thought, like, big deal. So it's 14, and it kind of looks like a diagram of a house. In fact, there is a house that didn't make it in that kind of uses the barcode as a diagram. So we cheated in so many ways. Which one do you want to see? Oh, the QR. Oh. There you go. That is not the diagram of a house. I think I lost battery. That's not the diagram of a house, but might be really interesting to try to make it such.
Oh, hi, hello.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, so you mentioned with the last one that you had to deal with floodplains and things like that. So obviously, especially after Sandy, a lot of places got rezoned for flood zones. How, for any sort of change in zoning code when you're redoing a building, how often or how much of a percentage of that project does it usually end up having to change like a significant portion of the building? And at what point do you feel like, for whatever reason, it's just not possible to keep adapting a building?
Yeah, that's, can you hear me?
Sabina?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's and of course, they started out knowing that the entire building needed to be renovated because we had to make a flood, basically a bathtub. So we knew that all the cladding was going to come off. And when we determined that the building essentially, couldn't be used in its current form structurally, you simply couldn't get in the building. Of course, the questions came up, well, then we should just demo the building and, start anew. And we just did a cost study, and it was significantly more because we would have been redoing foundations. It just would have happened. Like certain systems would have been modernized, and those costs, caused that to be unfeasible. We did do a study with the engineers of leaving the floor level at the existing 0-0 and digging down. But the farther you go down into the water table and where the floods are going to come up from, the thicker that slab gets. So they came back to us and they said, we got this all figured out, not a problem. We're just going to pour a thicker slab. And we were like, oh, okay, that sounds great. We hadn't had the idea of raising the roof yet. And they said, and we were like, well, how much thicker? And they said 42 inches. And we kind of used a few expletives and said, are you fill in the blank kidding me? So that's when going up the 18 inches, and then of course, considering raising the roof came about. But the buildings, you're asking a deeper question about the reuse of essentially the built infrastructure, built municipal infrastructure, which is what do we have, what does it all cost, If we start going into why it all costs that, this will be a really long conversation that I would not like to have on YouTube. And you know, once that gets rolling, we realize, you know, we're trying to save as much as we can. You know, it financially it's more effective. And again, from an embodied carbon standpoint, we've got a concrete frame. The carbon's already there. It's not sequestered, but the carbon's been spent on the frame. So maybe a wood frame, if we sequestered carbon, we'd come out ahead, but that's not, you know, I mean, you'll have to run a bunch of different LCA programs to see if that's true and if you even believe them. But that's a huge question that you're asking. Thanks, everybody.